Chapter 6. Snowy could barely contain her excitement. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping. She spun around and laughed as the skirt of her brand new dress twirled about her. The yellow skirt and bright blue top reflected her cheery mood, and the long red cape brought out the rose in her cheeks. She had barely believed it when the seamstress arrived at her door with it first thing that morning. She had heard the queen mutter something about getting her a new dress, but she hadn't really believed it would happen. Yet, here she was, wearing the first new piece of clothing she had had in years, and going out to pick apples for the first time in as many. It was going to be a lovely day. Walking out the gates and down the long path toward the forest, Snow White kept her gait in check. But as soon as the soles of her red shoes touched the soft dirt of the forest floor, Snow White could no longer contain her excitement. Letting out a shout of glee, she ran into the foliage, spinning as she inhaled the rich scent of the trees and plants around her. She spun and spun until, to her surprise, she spun right into the hard chest of the huntsman. Immediately, she stopped as the two came face to face, but the huntsman simply stared at her. Together, they made their way along a winding path until they reached the orchard. Snow White smiled as she walked among the trees, their branches heavy with fruit. She could see echoes of past visits, hear her mother's laughter, and the deep tenor of her father's voice. She felt a rush of sadness at the tender memories the place stirred up. But taking a breath, she got to work. She wanted to get as many apples as possible before the rain arrived. Reaching up, she began to pluck the fruit from the low branches. She smiled as she worked, and soon her basket began to fill. "Would you like one?" she said over her shoulder to the huntsman as she plucked the biggest and reddest one she could find. The huntsman hesitated before answering. "You are very kind," he told her as he looked around the growing shadows of the north forest. "It's getting late." Behind her, she heard the huntsman's heavy footsteps as he approached. His shadow covered hers, blocking the sun and Yes, sweetie? Huh? Let me see. Okay. What's going on, sweetie? Huh? Let me see. Go get you underwear. Come on. Come on. No, don't play with that. It's a nail clipper. Go, go. Behind her, she heard the huntsman's heavy footsteps as he approached. His shadow covered hers, blocking the sun and causing her to shiver in the sudden chill. Without turning around, she knew what he was about to do. If she was being honest, she had sensed it from the moment they entered the woods. She'd had a feeling even before then. With the Queen's sudden emotional reversal and the impromptu gifts, a part of her, she realized now as she tried to control her breath, had always known that it would come to this, that the Queen would find a way to get rid of her. The huntsman was there to kill her. Slowly, she turned around. Her eyes lifted to the huntsman. "I know what you're going to do," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The huntsman was less so. His hand shook as he drew his knife. The princess's sudden burst of bravery was not what he had expected. Snow White couldn't blame him. She hadn't expected it herself. "Why?" Snow White asked as he lifted the knife and brought it to her throat. She didn't flinch. She simply asked again, "Why?" For a long, tense moment, the huntsman did not move. The knife shook as he tried to steady his hand. Snow White stared at him, watching emotions flash across his face. Anger. At her? The Queen? Sadness. Because he would kill her? Or because of the man he'd become? And finally, resolve as he lowered the knife from her throat. He dropped the knife to the ground and grabbed Snow White by the shoulders. The bravery she had tapped into disappeared as his fingers tightened. "You must flee into the woods," he said. His face was wild now, his eyes red. "The Queen's mad. She'll stop at nothing." "But I can't leave the kingdom," Snow White whispered. "She is evil, child," the huntsman shouted. Then, looking around nervously, he lowered his voice, as if scared the Queen would appear at any minute. "And a liar. You were never told the truth about your father." Her father? What did the huntsman know? What hadn't she been told? But before she could ask, the man pushed her forward toward the path on the other side of the orchard, the path that led deeper into the woods and farther from the castle. Tripping, Snow White nearly fell but righted herself. Turning, she silently pleaded with the huntsman to stop this and let her return. But the look on his face sent a shiver of fear down her spine. He was truly scared. "Go! Run, child!" he insisted, waving her toward the woods. "Never come back, or she will kill you." But the huntsman had said something that Snow White valued more than her life. "But what about my father?" she questioned. The huntsman would speak no further. He waved his hand at her as if he were trying to banish her from his sight. "Now! Go! Please! Before I change my mind! Go!" This time, Snow White didn't hesitate. She turned and took off at a run, her red cape billowing behind her. In the sky, the clouds got darker, and thunder rumbled, echoing the pounding of her heart. Snow White ran and ran, branches lashed at her face, and mud covered her legs as she stumbled through the woods. She felt eyes on her and picked up her pace until she was sprinting. An owl hooted, and she nearly let out a scream, tripping as wings rustled overhead. In the growing dark, every noise sounded louder. Snow White had no idea how long she had been running or in what direction she was heading. She was too scared to stop. Then she felt something grab the back of her dress and pull. Letting out a cry, she turned and saw that the end of her dress had snagged on a branch. Frantically, she tugged until it came loose. But the sudden release sent her flying forward, and she slammed into a larger tree trunk. Shaking her head, Snow White began to run again. Animals called out in the night, and the moon slid behind a shadow, casting the forest into darkness. And still she kept going. With another cry, she felt the ground disappear underneath her feet. She began to fall. Reaching out, she grasped at air, trying to find something, anything, to grab hold of. Her fingers closed around a vine, and she clung to it, stopping her descent. but her relief lasted only a moment. With a horrific ripping sound, the vine snapped, and Snow White once again began to fall. There was a splash, and she felt intense cold as she plunged into murky water. Soaked and shocked, Snow White was dragged down by her heavy dress, and she fought toward the surface. Bubbles rose around her as she kicked desperately, but her wrists were caught in the long weeds that covered the floor of whatever body of water she had landed in. Snow White tugged desperately at the weeds, trying to free herself, but every tug just caused the weeds to tighten around her wrist. Her lungs ached for air, and she felt her chest tightening. She wasn't going to make it. After all that, she was going to die, just like the Queen had wanted. Her eyes began to flutter closed, and then, just before she gave in to the darkness, she saw a flash of silver. Her locket! It had somehow come loose and was floating away from her, toward the surface. With a burst of strength she didn't know she had, Snow White rallied, ripping the weeds that trapped her. Grabbing the locket, she kicked toward the surface. Breaking through the water, she gasped, gulping in air. For a moment she stayed there, treading water and pulling air back into her oxygen-starved lungs. Then, slowly, she swam to the water's edge and lifted herself onto dry land. Lying there, Snow White didn't know what to do. She was soaking wet. She was alone in a strange dark forest. She had no idea how to get back to the castle, and even if she'd known, she wouldn't have been able to go there, for fear of being killed by the Queen. She had nearly drowned, and if that wasn't bad enough, she realized as she sat up that there was a pair of eyes staring at her from the shadows. Wonderful, she thought ruefully. Now I'm going to be attacked by a wild animal. But to her surprise, what emerged from the woods wasn't a creature out to harm her, but rather a deer. It hovered at the forest's edge, staring at her with gentle, warm eyes. Snow White smiled at the sight. Even though she was sad and scared, the deer gave her a sense of hope. She reached into her dress, pulled out a soggy piece of bread, and offered it to the animal. The deer walked over on its long, spindly legs and gingerly took the gift. Then, as Snow White watched, more animals appeared. A rabbit hopped to her and nuzzled her hand. Several squirrels ran in front of her and then toward a nearly hidden trail on the other side of the water. The deer looked at Snow White and then at the squirrels. Then the deer began to walk toward them. It's like they want me to follow them, Snow White thought. Getting to her feet, she took a deep breath. Well then, I guess I should do as they wish. Lifting her skirt, she walked after the parade of woodland creatures. To where, she didn't know. But for the first time, she had realized what the Queen wanted to do with her. She felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps things would be okay after all.